Everyone can see. All right, I'm hoping everyone can see my screen there. And as Emily mentioned, my name is Keenan McKinney. I'm a director in the trust services practice of Armanino. Armanino is based here in St. Louis, or has a St. Louis office. For some of you who might be familiar with the St. Louis area, I previously worked with Brown Smith Wallace, based here in St. Louis, and we merged with Armanino about mid-year last year. So if you remember Brown Smith Wallace, we are now part of Armanino Group. A little bit about my background. I have over 27 years of internal audit and project management experience, with 10 of those years being in local government. I worked here in the city of St. Louis, local government for 10 years. And that included involvement in administration of our grant sub-recipient monitoring program with the city of St. Louis. So I've had some exposure to local government. I had some exposure to grants, and I continue to work with a number of governmental clients as part of my role with Armanino. So let's talk about our subject today. You know, obviously, I think all of you are familiar with the American Rescue Plan Act. What you'll find as I start to go through this material is that a lot of this material are reporting requirements, a lot of the supporting data you are familiar with as a governmental entity, whether it be your financial data. If you receive and work with grants, you'll be familiar with the typical type of programmatic or performance measure data that you have to report as part of those grants. So a lot of the information itself is not unfamiliar, maybe just the way that you have to report it, and maybe some additional other nuances might be slightly new. But if you're working in local government, financial reporting as far as expenditures, grant programmatic measures, things of that nature, it won't be new to you at all there. And one other thing I want to point out before I jump into the agenda is a lot of your reporting requirements are going to be based on a couple of factors. One is going to be based on the type of governmental entity that you are, particularly the size of your entity, whether it's a state level, U.S. territory, or you're a small municipality. The other thing that's going to really impact the extent of your reporting requirements are the type of projects and expenditures that you have. So the more projects or the more expenditure categories that you utilize the funds for, the more reporting requirements that you'll have. So, and then lastly, there's a lot of material out on the Treasury's website, and I'll give you the Treasury link momentarily. There's no way we can cover all of that material within this 1 hour session. So I'm really going to be kind of skimming the surface of it. Definitely, there'll be information for you to follow to get to the Treasury website and review that information in detail there. So let's go ahead and jump into our agenda for today. So the first item there, we'll walk through the American Rescue Plan Act. And as I stated, I expect that most of you are familiar with the act. So we're not going to spend any time really going through the final rule and what's allowable from a cost standpoint or what's not allowable and things of that nature. We're really going to focus on the reporting aspects there. But definitely, if you want more information regarding the act, definitely take a look at the Treasury's website, pull down the final rule. They've got some frequently asked questions and things of that nature that can help you better understand allowable cost or ineligible cost and things of that nature there. Then secondly, we'll go through the overview of the reporting requirements. I'll give you a quick overview of the types of reports and the due dates required for those reports. Then thirdly, we'll cover the key elements of the reports. And this is really the meat and heart of the presentation. What type of information are you required to provide in these reports for your respective governmental entities there? And then fourthly, do a quick overview of the process for submitting the reports, and then we'll close out with some preparation tips for meeting those reporting requirements there. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So what's the American Rescue Plan Act? Real quickly, almost a month to date, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law, and it addressed funding for both state and local governments. And so he created two funds and then combined those into what's called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds program. You'll hear me referring to it during this presentation as the fund or the act or the ARPA Act or what have you there. And then lastly, $350 billion are supposed to be allocated out. And the primary driver of this allocation is your population size, as well as some other factors there, okay? So what are your reporting requirements? All right, so quick overview. This document here that you see on the screen, the compliance reporting guidance, this is the primary document that outlines your reporting requirements there. There are several other guides as well that complement this document here, but this is your starting point here. There are about 3 versions, or they're up to the 3rd version of this document. So if you notice there in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that it says February 28th, version 3. So based on this, you could tell that, periodically this document is being updated. So as you're going out here and you're starting to work on your reporting requirements, make sure that you're staying abreast of any updates to this compliance and reporting guidance. It does a really good job on the last page of the guidance of summarizing those changes. So for instance, on the last page, it notes a table that says for version 3, here are the changes that are applicable to this version. That way you don't have to review the entire document again just to understand what those changes are. And the other thing I want to point out here is that I really encourage all of the listeners to review this document in detail. And if there's anyone on your teams who has management oversight responsibility, who's going to play a key role in this process, definitely review this guide, identify those areas that will be most applicable to those team members so that they could be familiar or become familiar with the guidance there. All right. So what does the guidance require? So for each of you, you could be required to report or provide up to 4 reports. So the first report there is the interim report. And that's a one-time report that just provides a general overview of the status and uses of your funds. And the guidelines only required that this report be provided last year in August, or if you received funding subsequent to August up to October of 2021, then you were required to provide this report within 60 days of receiving that funding. So because of the timeline and the due dates that have passed there, we're not going to spend a lot of time in this presentation discussing the interim report. And actually a lot of the information, or some of the information in the interim report, is actually covered or required to be reported in more detail in the project and expenditure reports in this recovery plan report. Speaking of, the next report, or 2 reports, are the project and expenditure reports. And those are required to be provided either quarterly or annually, once again, depending on the type of organization that you are, or governmental entity that you are. And I'll get to that momentarily. And then secondly is the recovery plan performance report. This is primarily a document that will cover more your programmatic and performance measure aspects of your projects. But most of your time will be spent, and most of your effort will be spent preparing and pulling together the information to meet the requirements of the project and expenditure report. So just moving forward here. So this next document, is included in the compliance guidance. And as you can see there, it identifies these various tier levels. And so these tier levels represent the various types of governmental entities, starting with the largest entities, which are your states and your metropolitan cities with residents over 250,000, going down to your smaller municipalities there. And one thing you'll notice here is that within tier 2 and tier 5, you'll see that it makes reference to these NEUs here. The NEUs there means non-entitlement units. And those are particularly those populations, or those municipalities with populations less than 50,000 people. If you go back and look at a prior version of this guidance, as I mentioned, we're on version 3. If you were to look at version, I believe 1 and 2, these NEUs were actually a separate tier. They were originally listed as a tier number 6. But with this current version, they have collapsed the NEUs into either tier 5 and tier 2. And then, of course, you can see over here, they provide commentary regarding those reports there. A couple of comments here. Obviously, as I mentioned, the interim report was due August 21st, or 60 days after receipt of funding if received by October 15th. So as I mentioned, we won't spend much time discussing the interim report during this presentation. The next item there, the project expenditure reports, as you can see, tiers 1 through 3 are required to complete the quarterly project expenditure reports, and then tiers 4 and 5 are required to submit the annual project expenditure report. And so as you can see, the quarterly reports should have started submitting those by January of this year. And then for those of you who fall into tiers 4 and 5, you'll start submitting your expenditure report next year. All right, and then lastly, probably some good news for a lot of you on this call who might be part of tier 2 through 5. The recovery plan report is only applicable to those that fall into tier 1, and it's an annual report there. So for a lot of you on this call, you may not have to worry about this. So when I discuss this report, you might take 5 minutes to do a little multitasking or whatnot, or you may stay and listen because you're interested in what types of information is included there. So this is a good table to give you an idea. If you haven't been exposed to this reporting guidance, this is the first place you would want to start to determine what your reporting requirements will entail there. All right. Okay. And then continuing on in the guidance, it includes a couple of tables that outlines your reporting schedules here. So it notes out the reporting periods as well as the due dates for each of the reports. And I think these are some really good reports if you want to, or tables, I should say, if you want to provide this information to your communities for transparency purposes, if you want to share it with your governing bodies, whether it be your boards or your city councils. I think this is a good document to share with those groups so that they're aware of your reporting requirements, but also it helps you to manage your reporting schedules internally and making sure that you set internal due dates to meet these. So as you can see, this is for the quarterly reports. And as I mentioned there, the first report was due January 30th, with the next one being April 30th. And that will cover every quarter or your quarters from January through March there. All right. And then, of course, they also have a table for your annual reporting, obviously noting the 12-month period, typically of April through March. And then you'll notice on that 6th and final report, if you still have expenditures at that point, it will only cover the April through December time period there. And then lastly, there's a schedule for your recovery plan performance report. And so as you can see there, the first report was due back in August 31st of last year. However, obviously, if you receive or didn't receive your funding until or after that date, then your next report will be due, or your first report will be due on July 31st of this year. All right. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the reports. So now let's jump into the meat as far as, hey, what is required to be included in these reports here? So as I mentioned at the outset, a lot of these requirements are really going to be based on, your tier level, what size or what type of governmental entity you fall into. And then also, as I mentioned, once again, the type of expenditure categories or the number of expenditure categories that you utilize your funds for there. So the first item there, as you can see, it talks about the project description, expenditure category, and status of completion. There is an expenditure category table, and I'll get to that momentarily. But you definitely have to make sure that, within your financial reporting systems, you align your expenditure categories, or you align your accounts, your funds, and things of that nature to your expenditure categories, because you're definitely going to be required to report information based on each of those particular expenditure categories there. And then secondly, you'll be required, obviously, to note your obligations and your actual expenditures to date. So you'll need to report those for the current period as well as on a cumulative basis there. Additionally, related to those projects, items 1 and 2, if you have projects that are funded by other sources in addition to ARPA, so in other words, you have projects that are partially funded by ARPA, you will still be required to report those. So for instance, if you have a infrastructure project that's going to be funded by, say, 50% by your capital improvement fund or capital expenditure fund, another 30% by some federal grant that you receive, and then 20% is going to be funded by the ARPA funds, you are still required or asked to report those projects there. And then you'll note the project status, and this is very straightforward. Has the project started? And if so, is it less than or greater than 50% completed? You don't have to get into various percentages as far as is it 20, 30, or is it 70 or 80? You only have to know is it less than or greater than 50% or whether or not it's been completed. And then of course, program income, if you've earned or expended any monies related to it, you're required to report that. And once again, as I mentioned at the outset, if you ever experience or work with federal grants, you may have encountered situations where you've incurred program income and you have to report on that. So very similar in that regard. And then the fourth item there is the adopted budget. The requirement for this budget only applies to the tier 1 governmental entities. So that's your states, your US territories, and your populations over 250,000. So for most of you, you won't have to provide the budget. And one note, or a couple of things to note here, the Treasury notes in its guidance that it is not approving this budget. It's just basically viewing it for information purposes there. So it's not an approval process of that budget there. And the second thing it notes is that the reason they're requesting your budget information is that they really want to understand, you know, the intended impact of your expenditures to your communities, as well as understanding the other or identifying other opportunities for outreach to your communities or to the states as a whole, as well as understanding the progress that you're making based upon your budget and the expenditure amounts there. All right. And then nextly, I ask for information that demonstrates that you're putting some sort of priority on economic and racial equity, as well as promoting equitable outcomes. And you'll find in the guidance that the ARPA is really pressing for our communities to benefit from the funds, particularly our lower level members of society. They're really pressing to make sure that we spend these funds to ensure that there's equitable outcomes for those underprivileged groups there. So lastly, on this slide here, you'll report on any contracts or grant awards greater than 50,000. And one note I'll point out here, in the guidance, it notes that the similar information is typically reported through the FSRS.gov. And so for those of you who are familiar with that requirement for your entities, it basically states that if you report this information through ARPA, you're not required to report it through FSRS.gov. You still have the option. If you want to, you can, but you're not required. So that's just one area where they're trying to alleviate maybe some duplicate reporting or duplicate efforts on your part there. All right. And then continuing on, the next item there, the civil rights compliance, you're required to provide a statement that basically notes that you are in compliance with the Civil Rights Act. And this is only required to be provided during the annual reporting. So if you're doing your quarterly reports, you don't have to include this information with each quarterly report, but for your annual report, it is required, and it's not applicable to tribal governments. So if you're a tribal government, you're not required to report on these civil rights items there. And then ineligible activities related to the tax offset provision, this only applies to states and US territories. So once again, for many of you listening on this call, you won't be required to report on this, but the guidance does provide some specific information that's required for you to report on to demonstrate that you are in compliance with this tax offset provision as outlined there. And then the next two bullets deal with programmatic data. So as you can see, this third bullet here focuses on programmatic data for non-infrastructure projects. And then of course, the next bullet focuses on those infrastructure projects. There's minimum data that is required for both, and that's common or similar between both of those items. However, for this third item on non-infrastructure projects, first of all, the programmatic data is going to vary by each expenditure category, and the guideline does a really good job of outlining that. Also, it's only going to apply to certain categories. So I think it's really only going to apply to about 11 categories, and I'll point those out to you on the next slide. So while there's a number of expenditure categories that could be applicable to you, only 11 of them will require that you report on this programmatic data. The fifth bullet here talks about programmatic data for your infrastructure projects there. And once again, it's going to require the same data that's required under bullet 4, but then it's also going to require some additional information related to each of these projects that you might undertake there. And then lastly, for your non-entitlement units, there's some initial funding agreements that you should have executed upon receipt of the funds. So basically, it's asking that you submit a copy of those documents with your initial or your first annual project. And I don't believe you have to wait until you actually submit the first report. I do believe that you can submit that at any point in time when you're prepared, when you've completed those documents and are ready to submit those. All right. Okay, so as I mentioned, for the programmatic data related to non-infrastructure projects, there are these 11 categories that you're required to provide programmatic data for. So as you can see there, you know, you've got capital expenditures, or if you utilize your expenditures for household assistance, paying premium pay or revenue replacement, you are required to report on some non-programmatic issues there. And then next here, as you can see, this is a copy of the appendix from the guidance. And as you can see there, I note that there are about 80 categories. So obviously you can tell here that I'm not including all 80 of those categories in the screenshot. Definitely you want to review the guidance for the full listing of those categories. So for instance, under category 1, there it talks about public health. There are about 14 subcategories under public health. So you'll see numbers from 1.1 through 1.14. And then for instance, for category 2, negative economic inputs, impact, there's about 37 subcategories. So these are the expenditure categories that you're required to classify your projects or your expenditures within those groups. A couple of notes here. You'll see over here in this table, it notes EC 27. Obviously, that 27 is referring to a footnote that you don't see, and then previous EC 7. So with this final version, or with this current version of the guidelines, and of course with the finalization of the final rule. So for those of you who are familiar with the ARPA funds, there was an interim final rule that outlined the various expenditures that are allowable or are not allowable. And then there's now a final rule where there's been some updates and clarifications. So what this is attempting to do is say, okay, this is the current expenditure category groups or reference numbers here. And then based on the prior interim final rule, these were the prior categories. And so what it's basically doing is reconciling the prior categories to the current expenditure categories. Obviously, in this screenshot, you'll see that they're all the same. But if you were to take a look at the full table, you'll see over here, you'll see some numbers or some numbers that are here that are now in different categories here, or vice versa there. So definitely, once again, take a look at that expenditure categories or expenditure table to make sure that you're familiarized with those expenditure categories and that your financial systems and reporting mechanisms align to those expenditure categories there. All right. Okay, so now that was a overview of the project expenditure reports. So now we'll dive into the recovery plan performance report. And as I mentioned, this report only applies to the tier 1 levels, which is your state and territories or other municipalities that exceed 250,000 residents there. One thing you'll note on the performance plan report is that it really focuses on programmatic data. However, a lot of the information that it's asking you to report, some of that information is actually being included as well in your project and expenditure reports. So if you're preparing or assuming you've prepared that information, obviously for your project expenditure reports on a quarterly or annual basis, a lot of that information you're going to use as the basis for completing or including that information in the recovery plan performance report there. So definitely, while this is a different report, you'll be able to leverage a lot of the information that you're including in your project expenditure report. Also, it's still going to ask for some additional expenditure information that you can also leverage from your project expenditure reports there. Also, you'll notice here on this slide, it talks about providing this to both the public and the Treasury. So it's definitely emphasizing transparency to your communities and your constituencies. So that's why it talks about posting this plan on your public-facing website, as well as providing that information to the Treasury there. So let's talk a little bit about what's involved in the plan performance report there. So obviously you can see the first 2 items there are focused on providing an executive summary as well as detailed information regarding the intended and actual uses of those funds. So in looking at the guidance, it asks you to report on things such as, what are your goals, or what are your goals for the use of the funds, or what are your goals for the various projects, and what are the outcomes that you're expecting or have achieved in those projects or those expenditures that you've undertaken. What's your progress? What type of progress are you making as far as meeting your goals and those outcomes? And what are any challenges or opportunities that you've incurred by implementing these various projects and services? Have you had challenges in reaching those underserved communities? Have you had problems or challenges in identifying those areas where those funds could best be utilized, as well as other opportunities that you might have identified as part of your projects? And then noting here, the next bullet 3 and 4 talks about promoting equitable outcomes. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there's really a great emphasis on ensuring that there's an equitable distribution of the funds so that we in turn have those equitable outcomes there. So once again, it asks for information on what are your goals to ensure that there's equitable outcomes there. How are you raising awareness to your communities about the availability of funds and services to them? And how are you ensuring that there's appropriate access to the various services or other related benefits related to your various projects and the expenditures that you have? And related to that, item 4, it asks you to describe how you're going about ensuring that there's appropriate community engagement and input from the community as to the use of those funds. So for instance, you might want to list out, hey, we've taken out TV ads or radio ads to make the community aware and get their input. We may have held town hall meetings to solicit input and feedback, or maybe on your websites, you have a place there where your constituency can provide feedback as far as their opinions and suggestions on the use of those funds. So it's basically just asking you to describe those methods of getting feedback from your community there. And then next, it asks about your labor practices. And basically here it's asking you to describe how you're ensuring that your labor practices ensure and promote the most effective and efficient use of those funds to complete your infrastructure projects. And also it asks about your ability to create job opportunities and employment opportunities as it relates to those infrastructure projects there. And then lastly, on this page, it talks about the use of evidence. And in the layman terms, evidence-based projects are things that are based on actual or expected outcomes that are supported by statistical data there. And this is really a term that's common to higher education. And as a matter of fact, if you review the guidance, it actually provides some references to the term of evidence-based interventions based on the way that it's used in higher education there. So definitely, if you're utilizing evidence-based interventions, so you want to report on those items in the report as well there. All right. Continuing on. So as you can see here on this slide here, all 5 of these items, particularly bullets 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, all of these items are very similar to what you've reported in the project expenditure report. So as you can see, it's asking for a table of expenses by expenditure category. That's very similar, and I'm going to go back to one of my earlier slides. As you can see there at the very top, the first 2 bullets on the project expenditure report, it talks about project descriptions, expenditure categories. It talks about your obligation and expenditures and the status of completion and whatnot. So as you can see here under the performance plan report, very similar information. It basically just kind of describes it a little bit differently there. So once again, you can leverage information that you've prepared for your project and expenditure reports to satisfy these reporting requirements there. And then the third item, and that's for key performance indicators for your major projects. And so for this item here, the guidance gives you the ability to report these key performance indicators using those KPIs that you develop of your choice. So in other words, they don't dictate, or the guidance doesn't dictate what type of KPIs you have to use for these major projects. However, under bullet 4, there are some mandatory performance indicators that it asks you to provide there, in addition to those that you choose to provide on your own. And on my next slide, I'll do a quick overview of those mandatory performance indicators. And then, of course, once again, it talks about your ineligible activities that related to the tax offset provision. So as I mentioned, this is the same requirement that was included in the project expenditure report. So once again, definitely leverage that information there. So once again, I just want to emphasize to you that a lot of the information that's required in this project, in the recovery plan performance report is very similar or exactly the same information that's required in your project expenditure report. So just keep that in mind as you start to work on that report there. So I had mentioned some of the mandatory performance indicators that are required. So this is an example of some of those items that you're required to report on. There's not a very long, extensive list, so I might have captured a good bulk of those, but nonetheless, definitely you want to review the guidance to make sure that you identify all applicable categories, expense categories, as well as the required KPIs. So for instance, you can see here for household assistance, it notes expenditure categories 2.2 and 2.5 and so on. And it notes your KPI as the number of people or households receiving eviction prevention services there. So also I'll add, once again, I'll reiterate that if you have received federal grants or work with federal grants and had to provide programmatic data, this is very similar information to that programmatic data that you needed to provide as part of your federal grants there. All right. All right, continuing on. So this slide here, once again, this is from the guidelines. This is a brief table that the guidelines included to point out one similarity or a couple of key similarities, as well as a couple of key differences between the ARPA reporting and the CARES Act reporting there. So as you can see there, the main similarity is that in the project expenditure and subawards, the data elements for the project and expenditure reports will largely mirror those in your CARES Act reporting, obviously with a few minor exceptions. So basically that should say, okay, is there anything from if I have CARES, if I am doing reporting of the CARES Act, is there any data, reports, or information I can leverage from that report rather than recreating the wheel or recreating different reports and whatnot there? So definitely, if you report under the CARES Act, take a look at the reports that you're submitting there and evaluate those to determine how you can best leverage those to report under the ARPA Act. And then these last two bullets just basically point out a couple of differences. Obviously the timing of reporting for quarterly, the due date is normally 10 days on the CARES Act, whereas it's the end of the subsequent month for ARPA. And then of course, ARPA requires some reporting on program and performance through the Recovery Plan Performance Report, whereas the CARES Act did not require that information there. So just a couple of notes on similarities and differences between ARPA and the CARES Act there. Okay. All right. So now we've talked about, hey, I've prepared what I need to include in my reports when those reports are due. So obviously the next question becomes, how do I get these things submitted to the Treasury there? So the Treasury has established a portal that will help you or facilitate the reporting. And as I mentioned, there are a couple of guides that complement the overall compliance reporting guidance. So as you can see there, these two guides here, the project and expenditure report user guide, as well as the portal guide here, provides additional detail on satisfying or submitting your reports and navigating through the portal and how to enter information and where to enter information, things of that nature there. What you'll find in both of these, it duplicates a lot of information from the compliance guidance. So for instance, I think both of these include some sort of overview of the Act, as well as the general reporting requirements, in addition to the specifics related to the project expenditure report and specifics related to how to navigate and utilize the portal. The other thing I'll point out, as I've mentioned here, we're on version 1.1 there. So definitely keep an eye out for any updates to that document as you're doing your reporting there. So the last thing I'll point out here is that although this portal has been set up for you to input the information, it still may require that you prepare and gather some external sources or external reports to facilitate that reporting. As a matter of fact, there are some points within the portal where you can actually upload or do what's called bulk uploads of various reports or spreadsheets or things of that nature there. So you still probably need to prepare some documents outside of the portal to facilitate getting that information entered. So definitely you want to get familiarized with those types of documents that you'll need to submit there. All right. So to close out, I think we got about 15 minutes left. Let's go ahead and talk about some preparation tips. For those of you who haven't started reporting yet, I think you'll find these very beneficial there. So definitely review the Treasury guidance and review it again. As I mentioned, there's the primary guide, which I think there's about 30 pages dedicated to the discussion of the different type of reporting data that you have to input for the project expenditure report and the project, the recovery plan performance report. So definitely you want to make sure that you review that guidance. Any of the additional guides versus the project expenditure report, the portal guide, definitely review those. Identify those individuals in your organization that need to or will play a role, whether it's from a management oversight role or will actually perform a specific role or process or have a specific responsibility, make sure they're familiar with the guidance, and definitely make sure you point out those areas to them that they'll need to be most familiar with related to their role or responsibility there. Also, the Treasury has a number of different webinars on its site, and I'll give you a quick screenshot of those momentarily there. But there's a number of webinars on its site that walks through, for instance, the project and expenditure report. It walks through the portal, and there's a few others that provide some additional technical training and assistance there. So I definitely encourage, once again, everyone that's on this call, as well as those within your organization that's going to play a role, to take a look at those webinars so that you can get additional insight and training on the reporting process there. Obviously, get familiar with the Treasury's portal for submitting the reports. A good starting point, once again, is these webinars. It gives you a good overview of those portals, where the information needs to be input and things of that nature. But you also want to get familiar with the appropriate or set up the appropriate user credentials. You want to get comfortable with navigating through the portal and where information or certain information has to be input into the portal there. And then the next two bullets there are they go hand in hand. So you definitely want to evaluate, the sources of information within your organization. Where is it going to come from? Is it going to come directly out of our financial reporting system, or will there be other systems that we'll need to pull that financial information from? Are there certain people within the organization that's going to have or maintain certain information, particularly, for instance, the programmatic data? Are there certain groups, are there a certain person within your organization that maintains or is going to be tracking that programmatic information there for information for reporting? And then definitely you want to leverage existing reports. As I mentioned, or as has been mentioned in the guidance, if you report under the CARES Act, you might be able to utilize that same information or same reports. There might be some reports that you already have within your financial reporting system that could be leveraged to satisfy the reporting requirements here. So definitely you want to make sure you evaluate both of those systems to make sure that you have the appropriate data in a usable format to facilitate your reporting there. And then next, you want to make sure you assign your key roles and responsibility. Who's going to be responsible for providing the financial information, who's going to be responsible for providing the programmatic information. And then obviously when it comes to the portal, you're able to assign, as I mentioned, various user roles. So who's going to be responsible for inputting that information in the portal? And will we have multiple people or backups in case the primary person is absent or not available to make sure that that information gets input? And then also who's going to be responsible for reviewing and certifying that information related to its accuracy and completeness there. And that might be multiple levels of folks. Maybe you have, your one department or a group of folks that are responsible for reviewing it, making sure it's complete. And then of course, your city representative, whether it's a city manager or your a representative of the mayor's office or whatnot, is responsible for actually certifying that. And all of those are dictated by user roles within the portal there. And then next, you want to make sure you establish your timelines for gathering that information and submitting by the due dates. As you saw in the tables that I showed earlier, that gives you your dates of when that information has to be submitted. So you can use that to establish your internal timelines regarding the submittal of that information to your point person or your point team. So for instance, we have an annual report that's due April 30th. You might say, hey, we need all this information submitted to our point person or point team by April 15th. That gives us the opportunity to review it, make sure it's complete, make any follow-up questions, and get the information input, reviewed, and certified by the April 30th date. And so a couple of points on submitting and the due dates. I was taking a look at the guidance, and one of the things it notes, and one of the frequently asked questions was, is there a possibility of extension for reporting deadlines for those reports there? And it basically says, it comes straight out and says, generally no. But it does clarify that you can update and change that information up to the due date. So for instance, if you were to input that information on April 15th and you realize there were some errors or some incomplete data, you do have the ability to go in there and correct that information up to the due date of that information. If after the due date you recognize that there were some errors or incomplete information, you can correct that on the next report. So if you're a quarterly reporter, then you could update or correct that information on the next quarterly report. If you are an annual reporter, the system is open to you on the next quarterly interval to update or correct that information there. So there is no extension for due dates. However, it does have methods that allows you to correct or add any additional information that maybe you weren't able to get input during the original due date. But as far as any penalties, the guidance doesn't necessarily state that there's any particular penalties. It just basically states that there could be a record of late reporting that could lead to a finding of non-compliance, which could result in the development of a corrective action plan or other consequences. So I don't know what those other consequences could be, but that's basically what the guidance said. Next, utilize your internal audit department, utilize any external service provider to assist you in the process, particularly ensuring that are evaluating the completeness, accuracy, and validity of the cost and the allowability of the cost that you're submitting through your reports there. Wherever you can utilize them, utilize those groups to help you out there. Of course, as I mentioned before, leverage any data sources or lessons learned from the CARES Act reporting process, and then submit any questions that you have to the Treasury as soon as you identify them. As you'll see that there's a number of frequently asked questions with responses on the Treasury's website. So the sooner you get in there and start getting familiarized with your reporting requirements, getting familiarized with the portal, you can identify any questions that might not already be answered, and you can submit those to the Treasury there. All right. And in this last slide here, as I mentioned, there are a number of different webinars on the Treasury's website. So this is a screenshot directly from the Treasury's website there. And so as you can see there, I mentioned there is I think this is like a 50-minute YouTube video on project and expenditure reports and how to submit those. So I think I took a look at it and it was really a really good video there. So definitely I encourage you to review that video. This one was also a pretty good one, bulk uploads. So it gave you an overview of the process for submitting bulk uploads to the portal. And in this one, I also took a look at the interim report and recovery plan. So it actually kind of walked through the process for submitting those reports through the portal there. And then I just have a little screenshot here. It talks about additional technical assistance webinars. So there were several additional webinars that were listed on the website there. So definitely I encourage you to take a look at those webinars to assist you in getting familiar with the reporting requirements there. So I think that's about it. So as you can see there, for full information, definitely go to the Treasury's website for all of the guides, the links to the webinars and the other documents out there. And then lastly, I know there's going to be some questions, or there's some questions that's being submitted. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll let Emily decide if she wants to, or if you guys have my slides, obviously you do. If you want to reach out to me via email with any questions, feel free to submit those questions to me and I'll try to get a response back to them as soon as I can for you. So thank you guys for listening to me talk. Hopefully I didn't put anyone to sleep. with the material here, and I'm trying to navigate to stop sharing, so bear with me one moment. Okay, there we go. All right. So Emily, are there any questions that maybe I can address really quick?
Yep. The one big one is, are project and expenditure reports required if you haven't yet determined a project or spent any ARPA funds yet?
Yes. So if you have not, if you've gotten your money and you haven't spent any of the money yet, you're still required to submit the report. You'll simply state, for instance, as far as expenditures, you'll still simply state 0 expenditures. And then of course, as you go through the various requirements, you'll evaluate whether or not you need to report as far as on any planned projects that you might be undertaking. And you also could still report on certain items such as, for instance, KPIs or programmatic data based on your intended use of those, but you're still required to submit a report. You probably just won't have a lot of information that you have to input on it.
Okay. Is there a single source that can provide approval on ARPA projects? We have a stormwater bridge / culvert replacement project that is mandatory to complete. How do we know this project is approved for the use of ARPA funds?
All right, so there I would ask you to refer back to the the final rule. So the final rule has all of the details on the types of projects, particularly infrastructure projects that are allowable, and it will provide guidance to you regarding the type of projects that are allowable. My understanding is that the Treasury does not pre-approve any projects. And I think they don't do that is because one, they probably don't want to put themselves on the hook for approving something that later on they have to say, no, that wasn't allowable, but also because of the volume of inquiries they would get regarding particular projects. So take a look at the the final rule, as well as take a look at the frequently asked questions.
Okay, couple on this. Is there examples of all of these reporting forms that we need to fill out?
Yes, so what I would suggest is, and I can do a quick, well, let me see if I can navigate real quick. One of the documents I pointed out in my presentation was the project and expenditure report user guide. It has a lot of figures in there. Let me do a quick screenshot. I'm sorry, quick share screen here. All right, let me pull this over. I don't know if you guys could see my screen or not. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so the project and expenditure report user guide. If you scroll through here, there's a lot of figures that they include that provide example of, navigating, entering documents and entering reports. It even does a good job of summarizing the various figures that it has in the documents here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it gives you certain, like screenshots of where to enter information, how to enter information, and so forth and so on. I'm trying to get to a few, drop down menus and things of that nature. So that's just a quick snapshot of the project and expenditure report user guide. So definitely take a look at that for any examples.
Okay, well, we have hit the 11 o'clock hour. So I know there's some questions that are still in the queue. Like Keenan said, you can email him directly. You can email me if needed. You can reach out here to Stuart and Ramona for any questions as well. They stay up on all of that stuff. Thank you so much, Keenan, for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you all the participants as well. I did put in the chat that the recording of the presentation and the presentation itself will be posted on the MML ARPA page, but I can also email it as well. So I hope everyone has a great day, and thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.